Hello again, 102. In this part 5 video on chapter 21 of the Great War or World War I, we'll talk about Wilson's efforts to promote his plans for the peaceful world order that he hoped would develop from his 14 points principles and what will happen to this effort. And Wilson made a lot of mistakes. He spent 6 months in Europe and he loses touch with the political developments in the domestic scene because he does not understand that the Republicans have come back into power. The Democrats have lost control of both houses of Congress, leading Theodore Roosevelt to claim that Wilson could no longer claim to speak for the American people. The Republicans control the House and Senate again, and that has unbelievable repercussions in foreign policy. He doesn't take any Republicans with him other than somebody named Harry White. Who was this guy? And his closest advisor, he disdained his advice. Colonel House told him to take Theodore Roosevelt or Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Henry Cabot Lodge, his most prominent critics. If he would have taken one of those two with him to the conference in Paris, things might have come out much differently, but he refused. He has no Republicans of any sort of stature with him. He does all of this on his own. And he is received as a messiah in Paris. Viva Wilson! Viva l'Amérique! Viva la liberté! The French believe that he is the peace god and the second coming of Christ. And this adoration goes to Wilson's head. He privately admitted that he was now at the apex of my glory in the hearts of these people. He is going to bring them a new world order. And unfortunately, he has to deal with tough-minded European statesmen who have been forged in the 19th century world of realpolitik. Clemenceau is 77 years old. He is from the old world, and they don't share lofty goals or his American ideals. In fact, the Big Four will resent his efforts to forge a peace settlement modeled on American values. In the end, European leaders would force him to abandon many of his objectives and become a horse trader, not a messiah. And again, Wilson began his career. He's an inexperienced politician. He is an academic. He's years ahead of his time with some of these proposals. A lot of these things will end up being adopted later in the 20th century, but in 1919, these are pretty much radical ideas. And there's a famous iconic photo of the Big Four: David Lloyd George, Vittorio Orlando, Georges Clemenceau, and Wilson. And Wilson was on the far right. This conference at Versailles is basically Wilsonian idealism versus European realism. And they fought in public and in private. They would meet, I believe, 144 times over the course of those many months. And the French and British Prime Minister Lloyd George insisted that Wilson agree to their proposals to weaken Germany economically and militarily. Economically, through being forced to pay reparations, which in the 1920s the Weimar Republic will go bankrupt. And militarily, their military is stripped to a bare-bones police force. And Mr. Orlando was mainly concerned about land aggrandizement from the destroyed Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Wilson's health begins to decline. He's lecturing them about the need to adopt Point 14, League of Nations, his most cherished part of the 14 points. He believes that has to be a keystone of any peace settlement. And whatever compromises he might have to make and whatever mistakes might result, he believed that this World Peace Organization, the League of Nations, would abolish war forever. It's a very idealistic and moral point of view that really doesn't jive with reality. And here's the League of Nations defined. And it's an international organization that he believed is going to help to maintain international peace because it'll be somewhere for nations to mediate disputes. And unfortunately, despite his efforts, Congress will not ratify the Versailles Treaty, as we'll see, and the United States never joins the League. He really believed that this organization would solve the world's problems, making military action unnecessary, and that flies in the face of realpolitik and the balance of power that had been created in Europe in the 19th century. And these unrealistic expectations, because he compromises on many things in order to get the League part of the Versailles Treaty, and this is going to be a self-defeating crusade for him. His opponents chime in now. To substitute internationalism for nationalism, Theodore Roosevelt argued, and one of the last things he does, because Roosevelt will die in 1919, means to do away with patriotism. His close friend Henry Cabot Lodge, the powerful chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, also scorned Wilson and his idealism. He confessed to Roosevelt the violent hatred I feel towards Wilson. He opposes the League, he claimed, because it would involve sending U.S. troops into foreign conflicts without Senate approval. Therefore, they're going to have to make some changes in this document as it is worded coming from Paris. And Wilson had already compromised during the conference to French demands for Germany to transfer territories on the western border to France, as we'll see, we'll look at a map, and on the eastern border to Poland. And on other territorial matters, he's got to abandon some of his lofty goals in order to make sure that the French and the British support joining the League. And basically, these are the three areas that Wilson compromises on territory, reparations, war guilt, making Germany militarily weak, and also stripping all of their colonies overseas. 5 basic areas. Back in Paris, he lost his leverage because the British and the French are aware that this U.S. Senate is now in the hands of the Republicans. So he gives in to make sure that they would approve the League. And these are specific things that he did and what he compromised on. And the map will be coming up shortly. This is the Treaty of Versailles defined. We've already mentioned these ideas. And this is how Europe is going to look for most of the 20th century. The East will become communist after World War II. All of these new nations are carved out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yugoslavia will be a creation of the Treaty of Versailles. Today, this is 7 countries. The Polish corridor is established in order to give Poland access to the Baltic Sea. And the Baltic states are created independently for a time, and the Soviets will end up taking them over after World War II. Alsace and Lorraine go back to France as they were before 1870, before the Franco-Prussian War, when the Germans seized those areas from France. Now they're back in the hands of the French. And this is basically self-determination in action. The debate back home. The only way for Senate approval was for Wilson to meet with Lodge, that says, I don't know if you can see that, and others to agree to revisions, the most important of which was the requirement that Congress authorize any American participation in a League-approved war. As Republican Senator Frank B. Kellogg of Minnesota stressed, the proposed changes were crafted not by enemies of the treaty, but by friends who wanted to save it. Republican Senator James Watson of Indiana told Wilson he must accept some reservations. Mr. President, you are licked. There is only one way you can take the United States into the League of Nations. But as always, the inflexible president, who assumed that his opponents were both misguided and morally wrong, lashed back. Lodge's reservations? Never. I cannot agree. So he attempts to go over the Senate's head. He attempts to rally public opinion. He goes public, and he will then take this on a barnstorming rail tour to the American people. He wants them to put pressure then on their representatives to approve of the Treaty of Versailles and American participation in the League. And disaster will strike Mr. Wilson. While speaking in Pueblo, Colorado, after a speech on September 25th, he collapsed from headaches because his health had already been deteriorating when he was in France. And he couldn't finish the trip. He said, "I'm going to pieces." And with tears rolling down his cheeks, he looked out the train's window. They're headed back to Washington now. And he told his doctor that he had suffered the greatest disappointment of his life. And a week later, he has the stroke that almost killed him. And this incapacitates him for the remainder of his presidency. And only his secretary, his doctor, and his wife know his true condition. They hide him. They guard him from the public and from the other politicians in Washington. He won't resign or he won't step down. He remains in office in this condition until March of 1921. And the Senate votes against the revised treaty, and then they vote on the original treaty, and the irreconcilables and the reservationists again defeated ratification. And Lodge remarked that if he'd been a true idealist in regard to the covenant of the League of Nations, he would have secured its adoption by the Senate by accepting some compromise, some modification. They wanted to approve of this, but Wilson would not accept any changes. And the failure of the United States to ratify the Versailles Treaty, we're basically at war technically until the early 20s when the Harding administration comes in and will negotiate actual peace treaties with different Central Power nations. This has long-range consequences. Because Britain and France are too exhausted and too timid, they will practice policies that are going to allow Hitler and the Nazis to fill that power vacuum. And appeasement will be adopted by the Europeans all through the 1930s. And this is going to create definite problems. The war guilt clause especially filled the German people with hatred.